So as I said, it is in the political environment during, after the Persian Wars, and then during and after the Peloponnesian Wars. And it's during this time that's known as the Athenian Golden Age, where we see the rise of historical writing, art, theater, philosophy, drama, all of these sorts of things. Art really starts to become a political form of expression during this time. It serves as a focus of patriotic loyalty. It also helps to relieve sort of the stress of war, as we'll see with some of the comedy plays that we discuss. And it also helped Athens to kind of overawe the other members of the Delian League and to sort of really assert their dominance over Greece during this time period. And so, as I said before, we'll be looking at 5 brief topics that have to do with this Athenian Golden Age, starting with historical writing, Greek drama, some of the great playwrights associated with that. We'll look at Greek philosophy, and then some of the great philosophers associated with that. Okay. In the first place, we're going to discuss the development of historical writing, which is a written historical narrative. And it was the Greeks who really taught us how to write history. Remember our good friend Herodotus? Well, we're going to be talking about him a little bit more today. What made Greek historians different from what came before? Greek historians are different from their predecessors, which would mostly be the Hebrew scholars that we'd be looking at in this context. Greek historians really remove references to the gods when they're writing about history. They remove references to myth, legend, at least in respect to why things happened, as causes, as reasons. The Greeks really tried to explain why things happened on the basis of available evidence. History was not just a narrative of past events. It wasn't just dates, names, facts. History started to become an interpretation of the past. Why did things happen? What did those events mean? So we will turn to Herodotus first. Herodotus of Halicarnassus. He was born around 484 and died around 425. And he is often called the father of history and also the father of lies. We've discussed this in class. He was the first to write a narrative of the past in which he interpreted past events. He did not just look and write about the past in terms of the detail. He tried to explain what that past meant. And his writing really had a heart and soul, and really kind of created the history discipline, if we think about it. Herodotus is our primary source for the Persian Wars. It was his objective in writing to explain why the Greeks prevailed over the Persians. We had discussed in class on Thursday how important it is to consider the audience and the intention of the writer when we're looking at some of these primary sources. And this is one of the reasons why that's important, because Herodotus is trying to tell the history in a way that explains why Greeks prevailed over the Persians. Herodotus characterized the Persian Empire as despots, a political system in which the ruler exercises absolute power and the people have very, very little freedom, which, as we've discussed, is a gross exaggeration. And he contrasted the Persian despotism to that of Athens, in which the citizens enjoyed a far greater degree of freedom and involvement in their political system. Herodotus made the argument that freedom made Athens great. Freedom was what enabled Athens to rescue the Greek world from the Persians, which is also a gross exaggeration. Freedom by itself does not explain the greatness of Athens or the Greek victory over the Persians, but it is an interpretation. The next historian we're going to talk about is Thucydides of Athens. He was born around 460 and died around 400, so he's about 60 years old. And he is our primary source for the Peloponnesian Wars. Thucydides is an Athenian citizen and general at the time of the start of the Peloponnesian Wars. He was in command of the Athenian army section that lost in a battle to the Spartans. Remember when we talked last week about the Athenian system of ostracization? Well, the Athenians were so disappointed in Thucydides' defeat to the Spartans that they actually used the Ostra system to vote Thucydides into exile for 10 years as a punishment for his defeat. So while he's in exile, he writes about the Peloponnesian Wars in his book, Histories. Thucydides did not set out simply to tell a story. Rather, he placed most emphasis on accuracy, and therefore more emphasis on analysis, objectivity, balance, documentation. Indeed, he worked on a basis of verifiable evidence. Thucydides is also important in introducing the concept of causation. And for this, he's also called the father of scientific history, because he's going through it and looking at history in a scientific way, and using those verifiable forms of evidence. He did not just chronicle events, he really sought to explain the causes of events. And so his primary objective was not merely to chronicle, but to teach. And history was a practical guide that might assist future leaders. This is what he thought of history. So he includes in his histories the dialogues of between citizens, between politicians. He includes political speeches. And even though he wasn't there to hear those political speeches and these recordings that he makes, they're not word for word, but it was rather more like what was expected to have been said or rumored to have been talked about. And I'm going to use the example of Thucydides' funeral oration that he says that Pericles gives. It's a primary source that we'll be talking about in class, and you'll be reading outside of class as well. So Thucydides really starts looking at things and trying to figure out what causes things to happen. And so when we start talking about the Peloponnesian Wars on Tuesday and then Thursday, we're really going to start to see sort of this scientific history coming out when we look at it. And those are two of the great historians of this time period. So we're going to turn now to Greek drama and the development of that. Because this is an area of Greek culture that was really hitting its boom at this point. And it is so associated with the classical age of Athens that we have to talk about it. And for the majority of it, with drama, with Greek drama, it really has its roots and its origins in mythology and in religion. Think of Homer performing his tales of Odysseus and of the Trojan War and giving it as a performance in front of people. That's what I'm talking about when I say that Greek drama is rooted in mythology and within religion. So kind of going back a little bit further in time to the beginning of the 700s. So it's after the Dark Ages. This is the archaic age of Greece. So back in the beginning of the 700s, every spring, there are these religious festivals, as we've discussed. Some of these festivals are dedicated to the worship of the god Dionysus. Remember, Dionysus is the god of agriculture, of fertility, but most importantly, he is the god of grape and of wine and of intoxication. So usually, each city-state puts on its own type of festivals at this time. And in order to celebrate their good fortunes and to appeal to the gods for their continued blessings, they participate in these festivals. The festivals would sometimes become less of a religious celebration and more of a big drunken orgy, but not always. The Greeks long celebrated these festivals with semi-dramatic performances in which a single speaker told a story. And then in accompaniment to that single speaker, there was a group of people called the chorus, which would offer responses to what that speaker was saying. So over the course of the next 2 centuries, Athens really started to transform these rituals, these performances that happened, into more of a sophisticated form of literary drama by adding a second speaker, and then more speakers, and greater complexity with respect to the plots that they're discussing and the themes. Eventually, the speakers start to wear masks to better associate themselves with the speaker or the person that they're representing on stage. And this is kind of how drama starts to develop. A tradition began in which playwrights would start to submit 4 plays to a competition. They would submit 3 tragedies and 1 comedy. Remember when we were talking about the Olympic festivals and how there was the athletic competition, but then there was usually this sort of an arts festival competition as well. It's to these festivals, these competitions, that these playwrights would submit their plays to. The winner of these competitions would have their plays performed at those big, great festivals where they were produced and financed by the polis and brought honor and time and kleos to the city from which they came. So Greek tragedy is very different from the type of tragedy we think of today, from the Shakespearean tragedy or modern tragedies, in a variety of ways. So I'll mention a couple of ways that Greek tragedy is different. So in a Greek tragedy play, there's very little action presented on the stage. There's no explosions, no car chases, no seduction, probably not even any toga parties. The main business of the actor was to recite the details of a story which were already familiar to the audience. Indeed, most of the stories came straight out of Homer or other Greek legends, but many of these stories involved stuff like murder, incest, cannibalism, insanity, patricide, fratricide, infanticide, suicide. Very tragic topics, but not a lot of action on the stage itself. And in addition to very little action, there was very little attention devoted to individual personality. There was no real development of character. Remember, the people who are watching these plays already know the stories, so the playwright doesn't have to go through the effort of developing the character on stage. Greek tragedy did not deal with the conflict between different personalities. It didn't deal with internal conflicts of one person. And the third way it's very different is that the theme underlining most Greek tragedies was that the individual must remain in harmony with the natural order of the universe. That can mean a lot of things. Most frequently, it meant to do one's duty, that you should accept the fate that the gods had assigned you. To do otherwise was essentially to challenge the gods, to challenge the destiny the gods had assigned you. And so the Greeks had a word for what it was to challenge the gods, to challenge that destiny. They referred to this process as falling victim to one's hubris, your pride. To fall victim to one's pride meant assuming a role reserved for the gods. If that happens, it violates the order of the universe. Punishment will follow in order to restore the harmony of the universe. The Greeks believed that this process, by watching someone else fall victim to hubris, had a therapeutic effect, a purifying effect upon the audience. Indeed, the purpose of Greek tragedy was not so much to depict human suffering or to enjoy human suffering, but rather it was to purify the emotions of the audience by representing the triumph of justice. Okay, and on this slide here, I want to just talk about a couple of things. We have an image here of Dionysus. We have here kind of a typical and really well-preserved Greek theater where you can see where the audience would sit, but also this is the stage with all of the other entry points that the actors on stage, the speakers, could enter from. And below that is kind of a representation of some of the masks that these early actors would wear. And then over here on the bottom to the left-hand side is just a depiction off of a pottery vase depicting some of these Dionysus festivals. You can see kind of where the fun would happen. But on this next page, again, we still have some more masks to look at. And again, these are very interesting masks. They're meant to show the main emotion that that character represents. Again, it's not supposed to be seamless necessarily. And then we have the Athens up here with their amphitheater down here. Another example of a wonderfully preserved amphitheater, and maybe a less well-preserved amphitheater. And then kind of an artist rendering of what some of these amphitheaters in their prime, pristine condition would look like. Okay, So we're going to move on to talk about some of the great playwrights. Now, your book does talk about most of these playwrights, and some of the primary sources that we have for this week include snippets from these plays. My favorite, personally, is the Lysistrata, and we'll get to that at the end of this, because I just think the topic is so highly entertaining. So for the most part, many authors vied in these annual competitions trying to get their play submitted into the big festivals. The first great writer of tragedy that we know of is Themistocles. He was born around 525 and died around 456, so probably about 70 years old. His best known work was the trilogy called the Orestia. Anesthesis was anesthesis. He put people to sleep during surgeries. Aeneascleus. He was a soldier at the Battle of Marathon, so during the Persian Wars, and then later he wrote plays about the Persian Wars and sort of similar topics. The next playwright I want to discuss is Sophocles. Now, Sophocles lived to be 90 years old, and he lived through the majority of the Athenian Golden Age, and he's often considered one of the greatest of the Greek playwrights. He maintained in his writing that individuals should live in harmony with the universe and shouldn't struggle against one's fate. Here's an example. His most famous play is Oedipus the King. You may have heard of it as Oedipus Rex. Now, Oedipus was the son of King Laius and Queen Jocasta of Thebes. He was born under a prophecy that he would kill his father and marry his mother. And in order to escape this prophecy, and in order to escape the fate which the gods had assigned them, his parents, the king and queen of Thebes, ordered him left on a hillside to die, this infanticide. He didn't die, of course, otherwise there wouldn't be a play. Indeed, Oedipus, like many of our mythical heroes we have spoken of, was saved by a shepherd and raised in the city of Corinth, ignorant of his true background. One day, he was on a journey and got into a scuffle with other travelers. He unknowingly killed his father, the king of Thebes, in this scuffle. Later, he came to Thebes, and where he somehow managed to marry his mother, and he had several children by her. Now, this is the background to the story, which everyone in the audience who is watching this play already knew, because this came straight out of Greek mythology. Indeed, the play actually opens when a plague is descendant upon Thebes. So Thebes is being punished by a plague. Just like in the Trojan War, when Apollo was displeased with the Achaeans, with the Greeks, he sent a plague on them. Oedipus, the new king, promises to find out why the city is being persecuted by the gods. And he learns that the god Apollo is demanding that Thebes punish the man who murdered the original king. Therefore, Oedipus promises in a high-sounding phrases that he will not rest until the murderer is found. The whole story is slowly unfolding on how Oedipus finds out the truth, that he himself had killed his father, and eventually figures out that he is in fact married to his own mother. Eventually, his wife-mother learns the truth, and she rushes into the palace and hangs herself. Then all is revealed to Oedipus, who takes 2 pins worn by his dead wife, and tears out his own eyes with them. The underlining message, therefore, to this play, Oedipus Rex, is a very dramatic manner. It's that the individual cannot master the gods, nor can the individual, by his own manipulations, avoid the fate to which the gods have assigned him. Again, these great themes of Greek tragedy are coming out in these plays. The third great writer of tragedy was Euripides, born 485 to 406. Again, pretty old for this time period. Unlike the others, Euripides was much more interested in psychology and human emotions, the emotions of passion, betrayal, and vengeance. Remember, the Greeks focus more on the human condition, on the human situation, and we can kind of see this come out in these plays a little bit too. An example of Euripides' mannerisms is his most famous tragedy is the play Medea. Medea is about a woman whose husband abandoned her for another woman, not an unfamiliar story. But as a result of this, she became so far lost in despair that she murdered her own children in a fit of madness to spite the husband who abandoned her. And Medea, her husband, is actually Jason of the Argonauts. If anyone knows the story of Jason and the Golden Fleece, this is what comes. Medea is the woman who helps him steal the Golden Fleece, and it's just a huge tragedy. Another play by Euripides is The Trojan Women, and he wrote this in 415, right after a major Peloponnesian battle happened at Melos, when Athens had destroyed a smaller city for questionable reasons. The Trojan Women talks about the fate of Troy and the plight of the women who were enslaved and the destruction of the temples. And it discusses how the gods might be reacting to these events that happened in the Trojan War, but could really kind of be seen as a message for present day Athenians about how their own behavior might be perceived by the gods. So in the play, Oedipus has these women, and the play itself sort of questions, do the gods really favor this aggressive war making of the Greeks on the Trojan city? Do the gods favor the militaristic attitude of the Trojans themselves? And so it's almost a political message that they're trying to present to the present day Athenians that are sitting in the audience of this play. And so to move on to something slightly more happy, we're going to talk about Greek comedy. Now, these comedy plays were as highbrow as the tragedy plays were. The comedy plays were very lowbrow, doing anything to get a laugh. It's just a very outstanding representation of a very crude, belligerent, kind of Athenian people. And the playwright we're going to talk about is kind of the perfect example of a crude, belligerent Athenian aristocrat. And his name is Aristophanes. Aristophanes was born in 488 and he died in 380. So he was he was 92 years old. His comedy has lots of satire, lots of slapstick, and lots of fart jokes, surprisingly enough. But they were always about issues of interest to the polis. So even though it was funny, it was about relevant, important topics that were happening. He wrote about real people, real Athenians. He actually mocks Socrates in some of his plays. And we'll talk about Socrates later. His most famous play is Lysistrata, which, if you look at the slide, we've got a representation of Lysistrata over here. It's kind of a woman pulling up a stocking. I doubt they had those in ancient Greece. And then a warrior, watching. And this warrior looks like a Greek hoplite. And we can kind of assume that is what the situation is there. Now, below it is a modern representation of a play currently going on about Lysistrata. And we can see that they are doing the same thing that Aristophanes was doing. He's making relevant topics, this idea of stop the war, this is what democracy looks like, sort of things that are relevant today. But in Lysistrata, it's set during the Peloponnesian War that was fought between Athens and Sparta. Now, in the play, the women of Athens and Sparta get together, and they agree that the war is just super stupid, and that the men are idiots for fighting it. And thus, these women agree that the only way to end the war is to deprive all of their men of their strength, to sap the men of their will to fight, their will to live. So these women present the men with an ultimatum that until the war is brought to an end, there will be no sex. This is how the women plan to sap their men of their strength and their will to fight, is by denying them sex until they stop fighting. Well, the men laugh at the women because they do not think that the women can hold out either. And when you read the play, you see that that's a fair assessment, that but the women do hold out. It's not as easy as I thought it would be, but they hold out because they're stronger. In any event, the men begin to weaken, their palms get sweaty, their knees begin to buckle, their eyesight blurs. This is all discussed in the play. It becomes increasingly difficult to walk and fight. 5 days go by. After 5 days, the men cave. The war is over, and for once, there literally is a happy ending. But what makes this play so interesting is that even with its inherent silliness and kind of ridiculousness, it does prove that the Greeks are very much in tune to human nature, and even through comedy, they're able to make relevant comments on political events and what's happening. And so Greek theater is essentially the culture and the intellectual foundations that really kind of build up this Athenian Golden Age. And to kind of give this a little bit more of a political context, I want you to remember that every person in that audience is aware of what's going on. The majority of them are men, probably citizens who are voters. And so these playwrights have a lot that they can say, and they have a captive audience. And so they're using the tools at their disposal to sway, just the same way that the politicians use their words and their standing to sway the citizens of Athens. These playwrights are doing the same thing, but in a different way. So we're going to switch now to discussing Greek philosophy, which is also about the people and the human plight and all of these things that just make the Greeks so unique as a civilization and makes them stand out amongst some of these other ancient civilizations. Again, it's that idea that they question their place in the world, and they take pride in their intellect and curiosity and originality. So Greek philosophy, it is frequently argued that it is the greatest and most lasting achievement of the ancient Greeks, and that it's a huge part of the development of their culture and their tradition of thought. So I've discussed this a little bit before, but we're going to reiterate it here. The Greeks established a new way of looking at nature, the universe, and human society. Specifically, the Greeks began to emphasize the use of reason, logic, the use of their brains, the capacity to figure stuff out. And in doing so, the Greeks essentially laid the foundation for Western scientific and philosophical thought. Greek philosophy had its origins in the 6th century BC, the 500s. Before 600, the Greeks, just like everybody else in the ancient world, the Greeks tended to explain natural phenomena, things that occurred in nature, in terms of the supernatural. Things like earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, tidal waves. The Greeks explained this stuff in terms of the gods. It was the will of the gods. Just like our Mesopotamian religions, just like our Egyptian culture, all of these ancient civilizations explained the unknowable in terms of the gods. But in Greece, after about 600 BC, there arises a group of thinkers that emerge out of the Greek city of Miletus, down here. They're called the Milesians. They begin to take the first steps towards science, the first steps towards philosophy. Their primary interests had to do with the physical nature of the universe. So they're asking these big questions that no one had really asked before. So they're asking about the physical nature of the universe. What is it that makes up the physical world? They don't know about atoms. They don't know about plastics. So what is it to them? The Milesians believed that all things could be reduced to some form of matter, to some single primary substance, which was the source of everything. They're not far off. For example, a leading member of this group, Thales of Miletus, argued that water was this primary element that was the source of everything. He believed that everything could be reduced to water. And why? Why did he argue this? He believed that all things contained moisture, like the rain, oceans, dew, sweat on human beings. He argued that everything contained moisture, and consequently, Thales of Miletus argued that water was the primary element which made up the universe. Well, other Milesians believed that the primary material of the universe included air or fire. To many of us, this might sound pretty naive. Nevertheless, this represents a radical and significant departure in the effort to discover truth. By not referring to the gods, but rather thinking and making making hypotheses based on careful observation through the application of their reason and logic. So it's not that the gods are making everything, but it's got to be something else. And so they're using their own human nature to figure this out. I think I've talked about how much I don't like math in this class, but any of you remember the Pythagorean theorem from math? A squared plus B squared equals C squared, that fun triangle graph? Well, that was created by Pythagoras of Samos, who was a pre-Socratic philosopher and kind of part of this movement of philosophers. So you can thank the Greeks for that math. So moving on, we're going to talk a little bit more advanced philosophy here. In the centuries that follow these Milesians, there occurred two separate and distinct intellectual revolutions. The first revolution includes a reaction away from this sort of stuff, like the Milesians. It's a reaction away from this study of the physical universe and towards a consideration of topics and subjects that are more intimately related to the individual, to human society, kind of like early social sciences. The first advocate for this new intellectual trend were the sophists. The sophists were masters of rhetoric, eloquence, techniques of argument. Specifically, they were teachers for pay. They taught the skills of argument to students who wanted to listen. The sophists were not so concerned with the natural world, but with effective and persuasive communication. And this is indeed a marketable skill in Athens, since it is crucial in the assemblies and in the courts of law to be well-spoken, to be able to be persuasive. Remember, the ability to make good speeches and to be persuasive was very important in Athenian politics and social life. Athenians really enjoyed listening to debates about politics, about theories, about testing and the challenges of preconceived ideas by skilled speakers. Think of these men in the agora of Athens, just speaking eloquently about a variety of topics. It was free entertainment, if you will. Why go to the theater when you can go to the agora? The sophists argued that absolute standards such as truth, goodness, justice, beauty, these were absolutes that could not be comprehended through the use of reason. That is, after all, what the people like the Milesians were trying to do, to reduce everything to some single absolute, to matter. The sophist point of view is best expressed by Protagoras, who was born in 493 and died in 421. In his famous quote, "Man is the measure of all things." Now, what this means, if we look at it, is it's meant that everything is relative. It meant that things such as goodness, evil, truth, justice, beauty, those things are relative and depend on the point of view of the person in question. Moral gray areas, not black and white. In other words, these things mean different things to different people at different times and in different places. Well, in Athens, this idea that everything is relative, this idea was thought to be kind of dangerous. Indeed, if justice was relative, then young men trained in rhetoric by these sophists could go into the law courts and win cases that were wrong just because they were using clever arguments. We could go back to many times in our own American past where persuasive people were able to get clearly guilty people off because they were able to use quick arguments. It's a common thing. So in Athens, people were actually quite concerned about these arguments that the sophists were putting out. If justice is relative, then laws might not be obeyed. Laws would be meaningless. And therefore, the entire moral foundation of the polis itself was meaningless. And so many people kind of began to attack these sophists as disruptive to the ideal. The idea that the polis was a community based in laws, a community based in justice and morality. This led to our second philosophical revolution, a philosophical revolution that was grounded upon the theory that absolute standards do exist and they can be found. And this leads us to our great philosophers. Our great philosophers, the most prominent philosophers in this second philosophical revolution, are the three most famous individuals in the history of thought: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And if you want a quick way on how to remember the order in which they come, I look at it, like on your slide here, as SPA: Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Socrates taught Plato. Plato taught Aristotle. Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. That's just a hint at what we're going to get to on Thursday. But SPA is a really great way to remember who comes first, if you're ever stumped on that. So first we're going to turn to Socrates, because he is the first and arguably the most influential of these great philosophers. He was born in 469 and died in 399. He was born in Athens, he was a citizen, he was a hoplite, and he was fully involved in the political affairs of the city. Socrates was a teacher. He spent most of his life questioning the standards of Athens in an effort to comprehend and understand absolute standards. He firmly rejected the sophists. He actually called them prostitutes of knowledge because they're selling their skills to students to buy. So prostitutes of knowledge. I guess you could call all professors prostitutes of knowledge. It's a slippery slope. The popular view of Socrates is that he was this big guy, kind of chubby, kind of ugly, kind of a slob. He drank a lot, and he took genuine pleasure in being a first-class pain in the ass. He spent most of his time in the Agora, the Athenian marketplace, where he would badger the hell out of these sophists gathered there. People would come to watch him debate with the sophists as a entertainment, as a show in its own right. And eventually, he turned from badgering the sophists to the crowd of people that were gathered around, and he starts badgering them. And he starts drawing a gathering. Students start to follow him and start to learn his methods of questioning. And he teaches them how to question things, but not for profit, because that would make him a prostitute of knowledge. He doesn't charge. The knowledge cannot be bought. That's really his idea, is knowledge can't be bought. He gives away knowledge, and he shares it with the sons of leading Athenians. This knowledge is found by teaching them how to seek the truth, not by buying or selling it. So he would go up to someone and he would ask them these impossible questions. What is truth? What is beauty? What is justice? What is the purpose of life? And Socrates would take those answers that these poor, unsuspecting Athenians would give him, and he would destroy that answer. And in the process, he'd make you look like a total idiot, because he would respond with, well, but what about this? And what about this type of beauty? And what about that kind of justice? Is this justice? In other words, Socrates would use that original answer to form the basis of another question, which would lead to another question, which would lead to another question, peeling away these fallacies that people use to prop up their assumed knowledge. And this process is known as the Socratic method, or Socratic dialogue. Or, I don't know how many of you have ever spent any time around toddlers, because they endlessly ask you questions over and over and over again about everything that just doesn't need to be questioned. And I kind of think of Socrates as a little bit of a toddler sometimes. So maybe you can put that into context. So the Socratic method, he would use this exercise for two purposes. First, through this process of relentless questioning and cross-examination. Socrates forced you to explain your opinions, to justify your opinions, to think, to use your brains, as much as some people didn't want to. And in the second place, and this is probably more important for Socrates, it was through this dialogue of questioning and cross-examination that you would find these absolutes. It was through this process, Socrates maintained, that you would proceed towards true wisdom, towards true knowledge. Socrates was a critic of many things, including democracy, including the Athenian political system. He thought that the important decisions that were being made by all of the voters risked a demagogue becoming too powerful and gaining too much support, and that rash and hasty decisions were being made. Example, we'll talk about it on Tuesday, the invasion of Sicily during the Peloponnesian War. He warns that if someone who's too persuasive, because they've been taught by these sophists how to argue, how to be eloquent in the agora, how to speak properly, that those people would rise up with popular support, and these demagogues would use that support of the popular people to make bad decisions that maybe only benefited themselves. Socrates saw himself as doing a service to Athens by questioning the decisions that Athens made. He called himself a public gadfly. He was keeping the city honest with itself by being a gadfly and just poking the crap out of it. So let's put this in context. Remember what is happening at Athens during this time. The Peloponnesian War is continuing. This is the war between Athens and Sparta. It's during 431 to 404, this second part, or that's the whole time of the Peloponnesian War. But during this time, tensions in Athens are really high. People are suffering. And here is Socrates just being an asshole. And he's stirring up the youth. He's questioning past traditions and customs through his constant questioning of authority. So after Athens, not to be a spoiler if you watch this before lecture on Tuesday, not to be a spoiler, but Athenian authorities arrest Socrates after Athens loses the Peloponnesian War. Athens was terribly defeated, broken down. It's extremely sad. And so the Athenian authorities arrest Socrates for the charge of corrupting the youth, for poisoning the minds of the Athenian youth. Someone that we're going to meet on Tuesday is a character named Alcibiades. Alcibiades had been a former student of Socrates, and Alcibiades had betrayed the city of Athens multiple times, and he'd even been charged with blasphemy on his own. And the bad reputation of Alcibiades tainted anyone who had associations with him, especially those who were thought to have had an influence over him, which, having been the teacher of Alcibiades, Socrates definitely fell under that realm of having had an influence on him. Socrates didn't just have an influence on Alcibiades, though. Some of the worst people who rose up during these Peloponnesian Wars and afterwards had been students of Socrates. Now, this doesn't mean Socrates made them go bad. It just means that they were wealthy enough that they could hang out in the agora and learn from this man, that they didn't have to be at home working, or they were out in the field doing actual farming work. It meant that these young men who followed him were the sons of aristocrats, were wealthy, and were able to just hang out in the agora with this weird man who was questioning everybody. So it wasn't that he was corrupting the youth so much as maybe the people who were following him were already a little corruptible to begin with, but that's a topic for another day. So anyways, Socrates is charged with corrupting the youth. He's charged with not respecting the gods. Is Socrates an atheist? So untrustworthy. Does he support religious practices as they are done in Athens? All of these things the Athenians are questioning. The elders of Athens, the people who, the nobles who are sitting on some of our ecclesia, on our board of generals, those sort of things, they're hoping that by charging Socrates with these crimes, that they can effectively just shut him up and stop him questioning everything that they're doing, which is pretty bad. They're doing bad things, and they're bringing Athens in a bad direction. They lost a war, and they just don't need to be questioned about it constantly. Again, think of a parent of a 2-year-old just being driven nuts. Anyways, their idea is that people shouldn't be questioning authority. They shouldn't be questioning religious practices. Athens was being led astray, and it was being punished because of people like Socrates questioning these things. Remember, this idea that, you perform the right rituals, you perform the right sacrifices, and the gods will bless you. Well, Athens was not being blessed at this time. Post-Peloponnesian War and during it, Athens was at a very low point. And so what Athens needed was a scapegoat. And that is what they found in Socrates. The real reason he was charged and eventually forced to drink hemlock was that the Athenians needed a scapegoat for what was going on and what was going poorly with the wars. And so Socrates is put on trial by the ruling council of Athens. And the Boule, the Council of 500, actually find him guilty. And of course, Socrates is involved in the process the whole time, and he's questioning what's going on. Is this even a valid system? What gives them the legal right to try him? And he even questions whether or not is it a democratic decision to even make Socrates, to make himself drink this wine, this hemlock, this poison. He questions everything about the process. He, in fact, is actually given the option. He can either flee the city in exile, or he can drink hemlock poison. And I don't know if it's a question of committing suicide or if he's being murdered or executed. It's kind of a debate. But whatever he decides, he decides to stay put because he believes in laws. He believes in justice, and he believes that individuals must submit to the power of the state, even if they question it. And it was important for individuals and for him to be seen to submit to the laws of the state. And so Socrates drinks hemlock and in a very dramatic fashion is executed by Athens. And it's a really sad story. And the reason we know about it is not because Socrates wrote about it. Socrates was dead. Socrates actually never wrote anything. The only reason we know anything about his teaching is because his students wrote down a lot of what he did and a lot of what he said. In fact, our second most important philosopher at this time, Plato, was a student of Socrates, and he took the execution of his mentor, his idol. He took it very personally. And Plato himself is a young Athenian aristocrat. He knew Alcibiades as well. He knew these people that Socrates was being accused of corrupting. In fact, he could have been included in the number of the people that had been corrupted. But Plato sadly never seems to recover from the execution of his mentor. Plato, as I said, is an Athenian aristocrat. And he writes an account of the trial of Socrates and these investigations that happen. But he writes it from Socrates' point of view, which is why it seems like we have writings of Socrates, but in fact it is Plato presenting these things as the point of view from Socrates. So one of the primary sources we have is Socrates' Apology, which is written by Plato. And it's not an apology. The phrase, the term apology in history at this time period means it's actually an explanation, not an apology. It's an explanation of what happened. And it's written, as I said, from Socrates' first person. And he defends himself as this gadfly. And by doing so, he's revealing the hypocrisy of the Athenians, the hypocrisy of the knowledge that they think they have. Socrates defends himself against his arrest and these charges by saying that the gods made him this way. The gods made him this way to question all truths. And if Greek tragedy taught us anything, that it is hubris to thwart the gods and to go against what you've been told to do. So in fact, Socrates was doing exactly what the gods had intended him to do. And Athens declaring him guilty and putting him to death is Athens revealing their own hubris. And so Socrates' apology is almost a Greek tragedy in itself. So let's talk about Plato a little bit more. As I said, you've probably gotten the point that he took the death, this execution of Socrates very, very hard, very deeply. And because of this, he really begins to mistrust democracy. He's really bitter that it was used as this method against Socrates. So in 385, about 15 years after the death of Socrates, Plato leaves Athens. He leaves the public citizen's life, and he goes out into the countryside and he opens up a school, the Academy. He opens this outside of the city of Athens for anyone who wants to study the Socratic method, as well as Plato's own ideas that he's been developing. And students flock to his school to learn from Plato, including a young Aristotle, who we will talk about next. And what Plato offered at the school was training in how to think properly. Remember, the sophists were, for pay, were training people how to speak eloquently, how to be persuasive with their words and their arguments. But Plato was offering to teach them how to actually think properly, so that they're making the right arguments, that they're being persuasive in the right ways. In general, Plato's objectives were very similar to those of Socrates. Primarily, he wanted to prove that absolutes exist. He wanted to prove that you can comprehend absolute standards. In order to do so, and in order to comprehend absolutes, Plato developed a doctrine of the ideal. Now, none of us are philosophers. Well, some of you might be philosophy majors. I am not. And I will admit, some of this stuff is a little above my head. And so if it feels like it's above your head too, do not feel bad. I have a video that I'm going to play in a little bit that's going to help kind of describe a little bit of some of this stuff a little bit better. But bear with me as I kind of break it down a little bit more simply. So this doctrine of the ideal. Plato argued that in order to perceive absolutes, these absolutes such as truth, beauty, justice, you must understand that the universe was divided into two parts, two dimensions. On one hand, we have the material dimension, the physical dimension, the world that we can perceive through our senses, through hearing, seeing, touching, smelling, that sort of thing. And on the other hand, we have this higher spiritual dimension composed of forms and ideals and that only the mind can imagine. We can't physically see or touch or hear these ideals. We can only imagine them. And that is the world of the ideal. Plato argued that it was only in the world of the ideal where we can find absolutes, absolute truth, justice, beauty. That is where things are perfect. They're changeless, they're eternal. It's in the physical world, the things that we perceive through our senses, that we hear, see, touch, smell, that sort of thing. Those are only mere physical, imperfect copies, imperfect manifestations of the perfect ideal form. We can't see that ideal form, can't touch it, we can only imagine it, but we can touch these imperfect copies, manifestations of the ideal. Okay, so I'm going to break this down into a slightly different example, but I think it might be more familiar. And this is not my example, because this example is, I'm super allergic to dogs, and you'll understand why this couldn't possibly be my example once I get to it. So I'm going to present this two dimensions in an example. So we're going to think about dogs. If you were to come to my house, you would be greeted by four dogs, a beagle, a Saint Bernard, a mutt, and an old English sheepdog. We can look at those four animals and see that they don't look anything alike. Physically, they're nothing alike, they're very different. But we look at them and we're able to conceive of them as dogs. They all share the quality of dogness. Plato would have argued that if our minds could not conceive of these things existing in two dimensions, then we would have no basis for grouping those individual dogs into a single category, because our minds can't operate on these two levels, in these two dimensions, the physical and the ideal. Because we can comprehend this nature of absolutes. So being able to see these four very different dogs and recognizing that they are all a form of dogness is because we can comprehend this ideal of a dog. And we can see that these are imperfect copies of that ideal. So that's kind of where Plato develops and expands these ideas. And he does this in one of his most famous works called The Republic. And this is, again, one of the primary sources that we're going to be reading for this week. In The Republic, he considers a number of influential things. He talks about political philosophy. He defines what justice is. He asks questions. Surprise, surprise, as students of Socrates ask questions. He asks how to achieve a just society within the framework of a city-state. How should a perfect society function? He comes to the conclusion, and we'll learn about this a little bit later, that states that society at its best should be governed by philosopher kings trained in wisdom and virtue, not by democracy ruled by citizens, because he sees citizens as dangerous and persuadable and prone to mob rule a bit. So here, we're going to watch a short video that explains one of the more famous aspects of the Republic. Now, this is called the Parable of the Cave. So we're going to watch this, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it when it's finished.
What is reality? Knowledge, the meaning of life. Big topics you might tackle figuratively, explaining existence as a journey down a road, or across an ocean, a climb, a war, a book, a thread, a game, a window of opportunity, or an all too short-lived flicker of flame. 2,400 years ago, one of history's most famous thinkers said life is like being chained up in a cave, forced to watch shadows flitting across a stone wall. Pretty cheery, right? That's actually what Plato suggested in his allegory of the cave, found in Book 7 of the Republic, in which the Greek philosopher envisioned the ideal society by examining concepts like justice, truth, and beauty. In the allegory, a group of prisoners have been confined in a cavern since birth, with no knowledge of the outside world. They are chained facing a wall, unable to turn their heads, while a fire behind them gives off a faint light. Occasionally, people pass by the fire, carrying figures of animals and other objects that cast shadows on the wall. The prisoners name and classify these illusions, believing they're perceiving actual entities. Suddenly, one prisoner is freed and brought outside for the first time. The sunlight hurts his eyes, and he finds the new environment disorienting. When told that the things around him are real, while the shadows were mere reflections, he cannot believe it. The shadows appeared much clearer to him, but gradually his eyes adjust until he can look at reflections in the water, at objects directly, and finally at the sun, whose light is the ultimate source of everything he has seen. The prisoner returns to the cave to share his discovery, but he is no longer used to the darkness and has a hard time seeing the shadows on the wall. The other prisoners think the journey has made him stupid and blind, and violently resist any attempts to free them. Plato introduces this passage as an analogy of what it's like to be a philosopher trying to educate the public. Most people are not just comfortable in their ignorance, but hostile to anyone who points it out. In fact, the real-life Socrates was sentenced to death by the Athenian government for disrupting the social order, and his student Plato spends much of the Republic disparaging Athenian democracy, while promoting rule by philosopher kings. With the cave parable, Plato may be arguing that the masses are too stubborn and ignorant to govern themselves. But the allegory has captured imaginations for 2,400 years because it can be read in far more ways. Importantly, the allegory is connected to the theory of forms developed in Plato's other dialogues, which holds that, like the shadows on the wall, things in the physical world are flawed reflections of ideal forms, such as roundness or beauty. In this way, the cave leads to many fundamental questions, including the origin of knowledge, the problem of representation, and the nature of reality itself. For theologians, the ideal forms exist in the mind of a creator. For philosophers of language viewing the forms as linguistic concepts, the theory illustrates the problem of grouping concrete things under abstract terms. and others still wonder whether we can really know that the things outside the cave are any more real than the shadows. As we go about our lives, can we be confident in what we think we know? A glimmer of light may punch a hole in your most basic assumptions. Will you break free to struggle towards the light, even if it costs you your friends and family? Or stick with comfortable and familiar illusions? Truth or habit? Light or shadow? Hard choices, but if it's any consolation, you're not alone. There are lots of us down here.
Okay, so it's actually a very good way of thinking and a visualization of the parable of the cave. And I hope that that helped make things a little bit more sense, especially when we're talking about these two dimensions, inside the cave with the shadows and outside the cave with the real light. So the rest of Plato's Republic deals with how Plato believes a truly just society should be ruled, that philosopher king we discussed. He decided that a state should be ruled by philosopher kings, and then those philosopher kings would be protected by a warrior guardian class. He goes through a whole idea of how a society should be ordered. He believes that through careful breeding and specific education, that a class of philosophers fit to rule over a society can be created. These philosopher kings will not hold power because they want to, or because they're looking for advancement or wealth, but rather that they feel compelled to rule for the sake of society, that their education and their careful breeding have brought them to that. These kings would be trained in wisdom and reason. They have emerged from the cave, and they can see the true forms of how society should and can function. Besides this warrior guardian class that would also be created through special breeding and careful education, there's also a productive working class that is not restricted breeding-wise as the guardian class is. It would involve fathers training sons in their crafts, doing what peasants do best, working to support the upper classes. It's a really interesting tale, and the part that we have for our primary source reading is just a little snippet, but hopefully it'll give you kind of a good idea. So next, we're going to talk about Aristotle. And now, Aristotle is the third in this installment of SPA, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. And Aristotle was a student of Plato. So he's kind of like the grandson of Socrates, if you want to think about it that way. Aristotle was born in 389, so 10 years after Socrates was executed. And he died in 322 BCE. He was born in Macedonia, so he's a Macedonian, and he was age 17 when he left home, traveled south to attend the academy under the instruction of Plato. Aristotle breaks away from this academy because he finds that he has too many differences of opinion and philosophical ideas, and these differences become more and more insurmountable the more Aristotle learns and comes into his own. So he breaks away, just like Plato broke away from Athens, and Aristotle forms his own school called the Lyceum, where knowledge can be found in a different way from Plato's idea of these perfect and imperfect forms. Aristotle offers a different way. Aristotle's works are really difficult to categorize because he wrote so much. He was such an extensive writer, and he wrote so much more than Plato himself wrote. And he also wrote on so many different types of subjects. In general, Aristotle agreed with Socrates and Plato on the existence of absolute standards. However, unlike Socrates and Plato, Aristotle had a much higher regard and appreciation for the physical, concrete, practical world. In other words, Aristotle believed that you can comprehend reality through a rational examination of the physical world. Sounds a little bit like Thucydides, a little bit. That by looking at lots of examples and finding patterns, this can lead to knowledge about the world. That truth comes from observation of the physical world. Consequently, Aristotle becomes the first empirical scientist. He was more interested in observation and experimentation than he was in theory. He would collect data, he would do experiments, he would form hypotheses, he would do more experiments and gather more data and revise the hypothesis. This was essentially the development of the scientific method. Aristotle is very, very important because he was one of these first thinkers to organize human knowledge into specific categories, which is what makes him so hard to categorize himself. Indeed, his own writings fall into a very large swath of categories, but we can kind of break them down into logic, metaphysics, ethics, natural sciences, and politics. And before I go on, I kind of wanted to point out something about the slides that I forgot to mention before. Oh, and of course I went backwards. So in this first picture here, the great philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, some of you may recognize this painting. It's a really famous painting, and it's so famous I can't remember who painted it or when. But what's important about it is these two guys in the middle. And these two guys are believed to be representations of Plato and Aristotle. So we have here the guy in the red is pointing his finger upwards. And this, we believe, is him pointing upwards towards the perfect world of the ideal forms. And then you have in blue next to him is someone that we believe is Aristotle. And it's kind of hard to see from this view, but I'll show you in another picture. But it looks like Aristotle has his hands straight out, like he's saying, this world, this exists. So this painting it says a lot about the two concepts that these two men are known for the most. So here we have a representation of Plato from that same picture. And again, he's pointing up at these perfect ideal forms. We're not going to watch that cave again. And then we have Aristotle. And this is a little bit better. You can see that he is pointing downwards, or he's pushing downwards, that this world is what's perfect. This is what we need to talk about. And so this goes to the heart of the differences between Plato and Aristotle. The politics that Aristotle talks about, and this is pretty relevant to what we're talking about with Athens itself, and even in today's world itself. Politics, this categorizing of different types of governments. This is something that Aristotle does. He wants to figure out, just like Plato did, how do you make a society that helps humans achieve their best purpose? So to learn this, to figure this out, again, he goes through these, he has a hypothesis, he collects data, he does experiments. And so what he does to find out what is the best society is he sends his students from the Lyceum out to different cities across Greece, across the findable world, to study these different cities, these different types of governments, and to report back on them. And so he finds out about all of these different types of governments, and he asks his students, they come back, and he sends them back, and he sends them back to ask more questions. He wants to know about their cycles of successes. What are they doing when things are going well? What are they doing when things are going bad? What happens with revolutions, with tyrannies? What happens when a government style is changing? He's asking all of these different questions, like a true grandson of Socrates. And so over a certain amount of time, Aristotle starts to believe that the greatest degree of human happiness can be achieved only in the context of a properly ordered and governed city-state, the formation and characteristics of which are the main focus of one of his books, Politics. And in that, one of his famous quotes, and it's at the top of this slide as well, is that man is by nature a political animal. And this is meant to mean that humans should live in a polis, that they need to be a part of a form of government, that we are all political creatures, political animals. So whereas Plato rejected democracy, he bitterly believed that the mob rule mentality of Athens, that democratic system, had not only ruined Socrates, but it had ruined the system itself. Democracy is poised to denigrate into anarchy or to tyranny when everyone is free to do what they want, and it leads to problems. Most people even believe that elites lack the ability to deal intellectually with complicated matters of the state. That training in such things is required. That's this Plato's idea of this philosopher king. Training is needed. Most people are meant to be that working class. And these are the things that Plato discusses in his Republic. But through the experiments and the questioning that Aristotle does and the data gathering that he does, through these investigations that he sends his students on, Aristotle is able to come to the conclusion and determine that the best type of rule is a constitutional government within a city-state. And what he means by this is that it is a constitutional government is one that has both an executive, a council, and an assembly. So it has all features of good rule. And he kind of creates these charts that we can look at here below. So he has these examples of good and bad versions of rule. So the rule of one, which would be kind of the executive, the rule of one, the good version of that is monarchy, a philosopher king. The perversion of rule by one is tyranny, so a tyrant. The good version of rule by few is an aristocracy, government by the best. The perversion of that is oligarchy, rule by the few, usually based on wealth or connections to power. And then the good version of rule by many is this constitutional government. And then, of course, the perversion of that, even in Aristotle's view, is democracy, this idea of mob rule. So even Aristotle rejects democracy as the correct way of ruling and instead turns to this idea of constitutional government within the city-state, within the polis. So Greece has certain elements of all of this. And the reason why he chooses a good city is because he feels like the size of a polis is a good size. It contains a sizable middle class and good elements of each side, and it's moderation. You know, you've got this stable middle class, and you've got politics, but it's in moderation, and this sort of middle way. He believes that the city-state creates a balance within politics. And so he incorporates all of these elements of good style of government, and that's what creates this executive, this council, and this assembly. Aristotle also said that public life is the most virtuous life that one can live. That people from all walks of life getting involved in the system is the best that it can be. Citizenship should not be based on parentage. Remember how we only have one Athenian citizen in our class? But rather that everyone who wants to and can should be able to take part in the government process. That it's an organic thing. That people living in a way where people want to live for the betterment of their communities is best. But when they're living out of self-interest is when it can be the worst. So in the end, we looked at all of this stuff. We looked at the development of philosophy from the Milesians, where we're looking at what is that one element that makes up the whole universe, to the sophists, who are prostitutes for knowledge, telling people how to make persuasive arguments and be eloquent, to our great philosophers, who are looking for absolute truths and what's the best way to find those truths. All of this shows is that there's this emergence of a new way of examining and understanding nature and the universe, and a new way of understanding and examining human society. Remember how he said social scientists? And it's through rational thought, through reason, that they're understanding and examining society. And it's this development that, in the overall scope of things, became the foundation for Western intellectual tradition. And that is our extra lecture on the Athenian Golden Age, which I like to think is quite a golden age indeed. So thank you all for joining me tonight. I appreciate that you're willing to watch this extra lecture. And I hope that we have lots of things to talk about when we come together on either Tuesday or Thursday after this has been watched. So thank you.